I'm talking from my home base, which is at the Lemington National Park here on the eastern seaboard of Australia. I have an Australian accent in my English language, so hopefully my Aussie version of English is clearly understood. What I'll do is use examples of two very different business enterprises that I'm involved with in the nature-based tourism space. Each of these enterprises is heavily involved with wildlife tourism in protected areas in Indonesia and here in Australia. Then I thought I might share some examples of destination management approaches from my home state, which is the state of Queensland here in Australia. The state government tourism authorities recently released a very good nature-based tourism strategy, and I thought I might share some ideas from that with you. And then we will engage in some question and answer activities. So the two businesses are quite different, quite separate. In the Indonesian case, we own and operate 4 Ecolodges, plus an inbound tour operation called EcoSafari Indonesia, and that's a wildlife tourism specialist company. That company's closed operations about a year ago because of COVID, and we've been able to keep most of our staff. We have about 80 staff around the 4 lodges in 4 different locations. And the way we've done that is through our not-for-profit foundation activities, by raising funds and doing local conservation and community work to keep our local staff employed at reduced income, but we've been able to keep everybody basically. And then in 2 cases with the lodges, get them to a standard of hygiene and cleanliness in terms of COVID, where for the domestic market, especially the governments at local, provincial and national level, the government agencies are using one of the lodges for their various meetings because it's deemed to be a high level COVID safe location. So we've actually diverted the business into a domestic, and that's paying all the bills while we're closed for our international markets. So that's a private company owned by a small group of international investors and a large group of Indonesians who are largely our staff members also. And then the other company, Blnna Burra Lodge, has got a lot of heritage in the Australian context, and that's basically Australia's biggest ecotourism collective. We have about 1,000 families that are shareholders, and I'll explain a little bit about that one. And then I'll try and focus a lot on how we engage those enterprises in terms of the destination management. But first of all, let's have a look at Indonesia. Now, our location matters in tourism. If you're on the top of a mountain or in a valley or in the ocean or beach. In our case, we're just below the equator. So it's a tropical environment, and that's very attractive to a lot of markets, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, that have strong seasonal tendencies each year, and especially during the winter months looking for somewhere warm, but also because of the iconic wildlife species. You'll notice how strong we are with wildlife tourism because in the logos for each of the individual lodges, we actually embed the sort of charismatic megafauna in the logo. So you'll see the orangutan in the Rimba Ecolodge logo, which is on the island of Borneo, adjacent to the Tenjan Puting National Park, which is one of the hotspots for orangutans. Orangutans are only found on 2 islands, which is the island of Borneo and the island of Sumatra. And their DNA is 96–97% same of humans. So the Indonesian government very early in COVID times last year closed down the national parks, and we actually closed down the lodge there even before that because of the risk of transferring COVID from humans across to the orangutan population. It's a very real risk. And so that lodge has been totally closed for over a year. The Satwa Lodge in Sumatra, I'll spend a bit more time talking about later, because that's where the tigers are, the Sumatran tigers. Tigers, we used to have tigers in Indonesia in a couple of islands, but only now a very small number on the island of Sumatra, and some of them are in the Waikambas National Park, which is the national park adjacent to our lodge there. That's been closed for over a year. And then on the island of Flores, we have two lodges. Mbaliling is near a forestry reserve. That's still trading, small but numbers, but it's got a very high COVID management standard. And then Kalamudu Crater Lakes National Park, we have a lodge there, and that's the one that's basically providing the survival money for the company at the present time, because that's the one where the government agencies, local, provincial and federal, are using for various meetings. And that's keeping enough cash flow for us to keep the overall entity working. Before COVID, those lodges were dependent on international markets. There's no international market for a year. And so what that's done is got our Indonesian staff in particular to make sure everything's in the local Bahasa Indonesia language, and also to look for new markets for us, which has been a good outcome, by the way. I'll just select one of those lodges. And in this case, we're going over to the island of Sumatra, and we'll focus on the Satwa Elephant Eco Lodge. Now, we use the word elephant in there because the elephant is the dominant wildlife species that people come to. And there's an elephant rescue centre there that we support within the national park. But there's also the Sumatran rhino, which is the world's smallest rhino, is in the park. And we do a lot of work with the rhino conservation agencies, and also the Sumatran tiger, which is the smallest of the tiger species on the planet, of the 11 tiger range countries. And this little lodge is only got 8 rooms. It's a very cute little place. And without that lodge, it's the only place that's suitable for international travel, of which there is none currently. But it's helped generate and create a whole range of village-based accommodation, a big network that we've got going there in houses now, because when we get groups, we can't handle the capacity. And so over the years, we've been able to work with the local community and create lots of local business opportunities there. And also use lodges like that as a catalyst to help the local communities understand concepts about destination management and about the expectations of visitors from different markets, and also how to put more value on the wildlife and the national park and the management of the national park. And so over a decade or two, we start to see some quite significant improvements. There's still a lot to do, but you know, the progress is positive in terms of its contribution. The national park, the Waikambas National Park, is a very rich biodiversity hotspot in Indonesia. Indonesia itself is a highly biodiverse destination in global terms, and it has a intriguing geographical artificial line called the Wallace Line, which separates the west from the east, and where you find marsupials on the eastern side, and on the other side you find your elephants and your rhinos and the orangutans, the primate species, and so forth. So from a marine environment point of view, as well as terrestrial, very, very rich environment for people who are interested in wildlife and nature-based tourism. One of our key markets is bird watching, and that's a very important part of the opportunity to educate local people about the value of bird life and learn more about bird life and present that to visitors. So we've had that lodge going for about 15 years. Couple of our major bird watching guides there now joined us when they left school in their late teens and as gardeners, and now they've learned and are confident in the English language and dealing with visitors We've supplied them with the technology in terms of cameras and binoculars and so forth. And now in their 30 years of age with their own families, just superb people when it comes to bird watching tours. So it's very hard for the visitor. The visitor can get easy access to the elephants, but the rhinos are in a captive environment. The tigers are in the wild. Very rarely is there a tiger spotted. Certainly, occasionally, a tiger footprint might be seen and creates great excitement amongst visitors. But they're a very endangered species in Indonesia. In relation to the Sumatran tiger, it gets attention because of its presence as a top predator of the species, and it's important as an indicator for the health of the biodiversity. And the destination of Sumatra as an island, we're all as destinations and as enterprises always looking for that unique positioning. What makes us different from similar nature-based or wildlife tourism destinations around the world? And the richness of those tends to be in the equatorial regions, from the Tropic of Cancer through down to the Tropic of Capricorn, in the tropical zones of the planet. And in this case, on this island, it's the only place in the world where you'll get species of tigers and rhinos and orangutans and elephants living together in the wild. And that helps. It's a very powerful marketing message. And of course, the marketing promise can only be delivered if there's access and education and awareness and conservation of those species. Let me now jump across to an example from here in Australia. I'm at home in Australia, of course. Since COVID hit, none of us have gone anywhere, so I've been here at home since sadly, just before COVID hit, in September 2019, we had 6 months of very bad bushfires across Australia. And at the beginning of the 6 months of what became known as the Black September bushfires, our lodge, which was started in 1933, was destroyed in the bushfires, and access was closed for 12 months. And we reopened 6 months ago with our remaining assets. So we're rebuilding the business currently. But our destination is inside a national park. In the state of Queensland in Australia, there's no private ownership of land inside a national park except for our lodge. And that's a historical feature from back in 1933, when the land was adjacent to the park. And over the decades, the National Park estate has expanded. And so we've ended up with 34 hectares of land, private land inside the national park. It's World Heritage listed under the Gondwana World Heritage listing in Australia. And it's a very rich in terms of biodiversity and tracking the evolution of the planet Earth from Gondwana period, when the continents were joined together, when Australia and India were all one big land mass. And there are remnants of flora and fauna going back hundreds of millions of years from that era, especially what's called the Antarctic beech trees, and some of those, and some of the fauna that's around also. It's a lovely part of the world. The world's full of lovely places, and we all have a responsibility to help protect those and present those. And this part of the world is one of those lovely little spots. So with this business, it's a big sort of ecotourism collective. It's a social enterprise largely, with a very strong environmental and conservation, education and research focus to it. The original ideas came out of the establishment of Australia's oldest conservation group, which is the National Parks Association of Queensland, which was formed in 1930. And then 3 years later, the members of that association got money together and bought the land and started to build a camping ground, and the lodges evolved from that. So we have a great responsibility for our custodianship and stewardship of the site and the heritage buildings. And it's been a bit of a leader in terms of where sustainability criteria, relationship, working with and on a destination management level has been pioneered in Australia. So 20 plus years ago, Blnna Burra was the place where the criteria for sustainable tourism in Asia Pacific was workshopped through over a 3-year period. And it provided the foundation for early players in the destination certification and enterprise certification process, which was Green Globe in Asia Pacific. And then that's evolved into other eco labels and brands over the years. And it's a case study that's has been used extensively in the last 10 or 12 years in various training activities with the Global Sustainable Tourism Council. And this is where I'm broadcasting to you from today, here at Blnna Burra. In our community, in our destination, as I mentioned before, at the beginning of the Black Summer bushfires in Australia in 2019-20, where we had 6 months of very bad bushfires and well over 3 billion of our wildlife species destroyed in the fires, 33 people killed in the fires. Our lodge was at the beginning of that, was the first major bit of tourism infrastructure destroyed in Australia. And it was a very sad time with generations of people in Australia and around the world who knew Blnna Burra and had an emotional connection to it, were very upset. This was just a little tiny eco lodge at the end of the road inside a national park somewhere in Australia, and all of a sudden we're in the New York Times and our national newspapers, and it was all for all the bad reasons. So where we were in a process with our local community as a destination, recovering from a major impact of wildfires, and we could not open for 1 year, mainly because of lack of road access. But before we opened, then COVID came along. So we got a double whammy of bushfire impacts and COVID. So we've been reopened now for 6 months. We're managing COVID very well in Australia as a country, and as a tourism industry or a hospitality provider, we have good standards in Australia, a good acceptance. I think Australia's done reasonably well in COVID management because the political leadership on right across the political spectrum listens to the scientists, and it's very much the science and the health departments that run the agenda, and our political leaders at local, state and national level, I think, have been very responsible and reasonably cohesive in their approach. Very different from what I've seen experienced in many other countries in terms of their pretty woeful, actually, management of COVID and not listening to the science terribly well. Now, just as an example, we can share this document with you. It's online, and I'll send the links to Ritu and also a copy of the report for those of you who might be interested. But here in my home state, the government of Queensland has released a nature-based tourism strategy, and it's really timely because it's in the era of COVID. It's realistic about the impacts currently of COVID and our expectations of opening borders for international travel. Our government federally at the national level is thinking about middle of next year before it will allow inbound and outbound international travel. But the way the world is tracking currently, where we're now, 2021, 2022, 2023. From our business point of view, I'm thinking more in terms of 2023, 2024. So in both the Australian case and our Indonesian case, we need to continue to focus on domestic market product and opportunities also. But with our Queensland nature-based tourism strategy, there's lots of thinking in our context about the way to manage destinations in a sustainable way, and ensure that the key asset, which is the natural environment, It's protected where it needs to be and conserved. In some cases, rehabilitated from various impacts. And then finally, ensure the presentation of it is managed well also. But we've found that the marketplace, and it's a domestic market, is increasingly interested in big nature experiences, getting outdoors because of lockdowns, because they can't travel overseas. We're getting a lot of redirection of what would have been money spent overseas in the Australian case. And so even with us, with our reopening 6 months ago, as part of our Blnna Burra product, we have what we call sky lodges. They're like very nice upscale apartments. There's a couple of dozen of them. On the weekends, they're booked out 2-3 months ahead. Huge demand for that sort of product. But all our competitive or similar product set is also having very strong booking tendencies, especially on the weekends. The marketing challenge is to try and get midweek business also. So we've seen this increased in environmental and cultural awareness. People want to get out and get some fresh air, have a little bit of isolation, social isolation, and realize that there's more to life than material gain, and that health and safety and well-being are increasingly a priority. What the nature-based tourism strategy for Queensland does also, you see the little circles there on the left-hand side, it helps us to understand and conceptualize those elements of nature-based tourism, what we've got available in terms of walking and biking and health and wellness and adventure, the food and beverage aspects, special events, animals and wildlife, environmental, conservation, and what we have is called citizen science in Australia, which is a wonderful thing, marine activities like diving and snorkeling, and so forth. What the Queensland example has done is also help people to understand a little bit more about the options for nature-based tourism, from passive engagement to more active engagement. So the spectrum, or the model for nature-based tourism, is one where what they describe as people who are passively enjoying natural attractions. It could be for many reasons. It could be for mobility reasons or access. And people still enjoy having opportunity to get into nature, but are restricted for some reason for getting too far immersed. And then there are people who want to have a good level, high level of interpretation by themselves or with a guide. And then there are those down the other end, the ecotourism sort of end of the spectrum, who are keen to engage, particularly in initiatives where conservation is involved with flora and fauna, but also from an educational point of view, learning more about the environment. And then there's another model here, which I've just presented for today, about the nature travellers and helping to try and understand the way they're thinking. Those people in the passive engagement with nature at the natural encounters, who might say that they love being in nature and the great outdoors, and then you move along the spectrum about learning about the environment at their own pace, not being pressured. Those who will go a bit further to seek out the information, then those who want to be a bit more active and participatory on their tour, and then those that want to do all those things before, but also engage in some conservation or protection of the environment. And all those things happen at a whole of destination level. It's very hard for an individual tour operator to go alone. You need partners within the industry, within your local destination, with community groups, many NGOs who might be involved in the area, your local governments, your provincial governments, and where it's necessary, your national governments. If you're in a World Heritage environment, there might be some international conventions you need to be aware and have involved in it also as part of it. But it's all about identifying who your partners should be and having a mechanism for them all to come together. We don't live in a perfect world, we never will, but it's all about the journey of understanding where you would like to be, what's the vision, and let's spend the rest of our life on that journey trying to achieve that vision.